Hello and welcome to our morning edition of Arirang News. We begin with these stories making the headlines at this hour. South Korea's top trade negotiator returned home after high-stakes meetings in Washington as trade talks remain deadlocked. He said the main objective of his trip was to highlight key differences between South Korea and Japan in terms of their negotiations with the United States. U.S. President Donald Trump says his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin has let him down and insisted allies must stop purchasing oil from Russia to end the war in Ukraine. 7 years ago today, on September 19, 2018, the two Koreas signed a military agreement to suspend military activities near the border. We take a look at what it'll take to restore the deal after it was scrapped last year amid inter-Korean tensions. We begin this morning with South Korea's trade talks with the United States, which are at a critical crossroads with billions of dollars, auto tariffs, and even visas for workers on the line. Our Moon Hye-ryun has the details on the progress made during the trade minister's most recent visit to Washington.
Minister for Trade Yeo Han-go is back in Seoul after high-stakes talks in Washington that could reshape tariffs, investment, and even visa rules between South Korea and the United States. Speaking to reporters at Incheon Airport on Friday, he said that the main objective of the trip was to highlight key differences between Korea and Japan in terms of U.S. negotiations.
We are presenting various objective data and analysis to make clear that Japan and Korea are different, and we are doing our best to persuade the U.S. side.
Yeo's visit, which began on Monday, comes after follow-up negotiations stalled despite a major trade deal reached back in July. Under that deal, Seoul agreed to invest $350 billion in the U.S., while both sides pledged to lower tariffs on autos from 25% to 15%. But the deal has yet to be implemented. Just last week, U.S. Commerce Secretary Lutnick warned that Korea must accept the agreement or pay tariffs, signaling Washington's growing impatience. Japan, which sealed its deal earlier, committed to a larger $550 billion investment and signed a memorandum that heavily favored the U.S. in profit sharing. In exchange, Japan's auto tariffs were lowered to 15% and implemented earlier this week. Yeo emphasized the urgency of finding a quick solution.
We fully recognize the seriousness of the situation, and we are making every effort to resolve the issue as quickly as possible.
Beyond trade, Yeo pressed the U.S. to resolve a visa dispute after immigration authorities detained Korean workers at a Hyundai LG battery plant in Georgia. He wrapped up his remarks by reaffirming Seoul's stance that national interest remains the government's top priority. Moon Hye-ryun, Arirang News.
Hyundai Motor President Jose Munoz says he hopes South Korea and the United States can quickly reach a follow-up trade agreement to lower U.S. tariffs on Korean-made vehicles from the current 25% to 15%. Speaking at the 2025 CEO Investor Day in New York on Thursday, Munoz noted that the company's financial guidance was based on the 25% tariff rate, but said a reduction to 15% would bring results close enough to maintain that outlook. On the recent detention and release of more than 300 South Korean workers at the Hyundai LG Energy Solution battery plant construction site in Georgia, Munoz also expressed hope for a bilateral solution on short-term technical work visas. And President Lee Jae-myung says South Korea will stand together with the United States while at the same time acknowledging that the need to manage relations with China. In an interview with Time magazine, he says Seoul can act as a bridge between the two rivals. Our top office correspondent Yoon Jung-min reports.
South Korea will stand together with the U.S. while managing its relationship with China. That's according to South Korean President Lee Jae-myung in an interview with Time released on Thursday, saying Korea's values of democracy and market economy are based on its alliance with the U.S., but taking into account its geographical proximity and economic ties with China, it cannot sever its relationship with Beijing. He noted that South Korea can instead act as a bridge between the rival superpowers at a time of intense rivalry. In fact, U.S. President Donald Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping are expected to meet in South Korea's Gyeongju next month in time for the APEC leaders meeting. The multilateral meeting comes at a complicated time when Washington is imposing sweeping tariffs against the world, against which Beijing is expected to call for an international order that it perceives as fair and just.
Probably APEC is the very good place to South Korea can have some kind of a role to play to bringing these two great powers together. But if that wouldn't be, United States and China could not come up with any kind of agreement of the trade war, and then it's very limited.
On North Korea, President Lee reaffirmed his goal to negotiate with the regime to dissuade it from pursuing its nuclear ambition, hoping to find a middle ground instead of an all-or-nothing approach. For that, he suggested halting their nuclear and missile programs as a short-term goal, followed by compensation, disarmament, and complete denuclearization as long-term goals. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
South Korean stocks are on a rally, with the benchmark Kospi climbing past 3,400 this week for the first time. For more on this, we're joined by Professor Shin Myung-gyu, Associate Professor of Economics at Yonsei University. Professor Shin, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me.
So this week, the government scrapped its plan to lower the capital gains tax threshold for stock investors, keeping it at 5 billion Korean won, and that's about $3.6 million, I believe. So is this the main factor driving the current momentum in the stock market?
Yeah, given that there was already a rally of the Kospi index from weeks ago, the change or the stance in the government policy might not be the only main factor driving the stock price rises, but I think that can be treated as the important factor. It seems to be an important change, however, since it provides the signal that the current government, together with the president, is flexible enough to scrap the policy that it really intended to impose before. I expect that it definitely helped the market. In the business cycle theories, investors or consumer sentiments are believed to be one of the most important factors that can drive the stock market and the aggregate activity. In this sense, the stance of the government seems to relieve the market concern that it might be the kind of the anti-market government, which would contribute to the further boom. And I also want to note that the Fed rate cut, which was expected even before yesterday, is also an important factor behind the rise of the Kospi index these days.
I see. And on the campaign trail, what President Lee Jae-myung said was that he'll lift the Kospi index to 5,000 points and get rid of the so-called Korea discount. Do you think this is a realistic goal he can achieve during his term?
I hope that the current government can remove the Korea discount as soon as possible, but whether it can be achieved that soon or not is not so sure at this point. In order to elaborate my comment, let me point out three main factors behind the discount. The first is a geographical risk. Given that investors require compensation for holding the risky assets, and the probability of the war in Korea is not zero, it is not surprising that we still have the discount. And the second factor is the corporate governance structure in Korea. So it has been pointed out as one of the major problems in the Korean economy. And given that market investors put more attention on the so-called ESG, it is natural to expect that the government issue in Korea would be the factor to lower the value of the Korean stocks. And the last one is the low dividend ratio, because the dividend ratio in Korea is lower than the other competing countries, and it has also contributed to the lower stock prices in Korea. And if you think about all these factors together, I think these problems are not that easily resolved in a very few years, implying that the funds and the government need to put more efforts to change the market structure in the long run. So I think it will take some time to achieve the target, but I really hope that it can be achieved very soon.
Right. And the Kospi also opened higher after the U.S. Central Bank lowered key interest rates yesterday, like you briefly just mentioned. And the Fed hinted at 2 more rate cuts throughout this year. How might these changes to the interest rates in the U.S. affect the South Korean stock market?
Yeah, it will definitely affect the Korean stock market, and actually as well as the other countries, maybe in the favorable direction. Stock prices might increase further for a while. Most of all, the financing costs of the U.S. investors would become lower, and the interest rate spread between the safe asset and the risky assets like the Korean stocks. And with the further expected decline in the interest rate in the U.S., the demand for the risky asset from the sort of carry trade would further increase, which can potentially raise the stock price further if there is no other changes like the geographical risk or the others as I pointed out.
I see. And looking ahead, how might the U.S. rate cut influence the Bank of Korea's decision on South Korea's interest rates?
Yeah, I believe it will help the Bank of Korea to potentially cut the interest rate. Because of the pressure from the president and not so bad inflation rate observed these days, there can be more rate cut by the Fed in the near future. And this can alleviate the concern of the BOK that the future interest rate cut in Korea might result in capital outflow due to widened interest rate gap between Korea and the US. And the inflation rate in Korea, which is the most important factor when deciding the interest rate, has been stable over the last few months. If you look at the data between June and August, the inflation rate has steadily declined from 2.2% to 1.7%, which is now below the target inflation rate of the Bank of Korea. And it seems that such trend would continue, and that gives more room for the BOK to lower the interest rate if they really think it's necessary, which can intensify the effect of the Fed rate cut on the BOK's decision.
I see. I guess we'll have to keep a close eye on the Bank of Korea's decision next month. All right, Professor Shim, thank you so much for your insight today. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
U.S. President Donald Trump expressed disappointment over Russian President Vladimir Putin, saying he thought the Ukraine war would be the easiest to resolve because of his relationship with Putin. Meanwhile, the Russian leader announced that some 700,000 Russian troops are currently deployed to Ukraine and vowed to achieve victory. Our Lee Seung-jae reports.
U.S. President Donald Trump says Russian President Vladimir Putin has really let him down, citing stalled peace efforts as Russia's war in Ukraine drags on. Speaking to reporters on Thursday, Trump said he once thought the conflict would be the easiest to resolve because of his personal relationship with Putin.
The one that I thought would be easiest would be because of my relationship with President Putin, but he's let me down. He's really let me down. It was going to be Russia and Ukraine, but we'll see how that turns out.
He admitted that it has become his biggest disappointment, adding that he still hopes for some good news soon. Over in Moscow, President Putin announced that more than 700,000 Russian troops are now deployed in Ukraine's combat zones, and also spoke of job quotas for soldiers with government bodies.
There are more than 700,000 now on the front line, so we should choose among them. but we should choose those who are motivated and are prone to this kind of work.
Putin said while not all servicemen will see themselves as future civil servants, the Russian leader backed the idea of granting veterans additional privileges once they return home. He also stressed that achieving victory in Ukraine remains Russia's key task and highlighted demographic challenges as the next priority for his government, signaling that the war effort and domestic stability remain closely linked in his agenda. The remarks underscore two very different perspectives. President Trump voicing frustration over the lack of progress toward peace, and President Putin doubling down on a long-term campaign that continues to reshape both Ukraine and Russia's internal policies. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
7 years ago today, on September 19, 2018, the two Koreas signed a military agreement, suspending military activities near the border. But last year, the deal was scrapped under the previous administration, and now the Lee administration is seeking to restore it to ease inter-Korean tensions. Our Oh Soo-young explains what the deal entailed and what it'll take to restore it.
Signed in 2018, the September 19th Inter-Korean Military Pact aimed to lower tensions along one of the world's most heavily armed borders, the Inter-Korean Military Demarcation Line. Amid dialogue between South and North Korea, then-President Moon Jae-in and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un agreed to cease hostilities across land, air and sea, moving quickly to remove frontline guard posts and work towards the demilitarization of the inter-Korean border. They also banned artillery drills and large-scale field exercises near the border and created buffer zones at sea, prohibiting live fire training and naval maneuvers. In the air, the pact established no-fly zones to stop reconnaissance flights and live fire exercises. The two Koreas further agreed to work on the joint recovery of war remains and the shared use of the Hangang River estuary. However, after the US-North Korea summit in Hanoi broke down in February 2019, Pyongyang resumed missile launches and later that year a coastal artillery drill in the West Sea, violating the Inter-Korean Pact. Tensions further rose in 2022 when 5 North Korean drones entered the South's airspace, breaking the agreement's ban on hostile aerial acts. And the North in 2023 launched a military reconnaissance satellite, violating UN Security Council resolutions. This prompted Seoul to partially suspend the no-fly zones and decide on resuming surveillance flights along the border. The next day, North Korea declared it would terminate the agreement. After the regime flew a series of trash-carrying balloons to the south, Seoul also declared an end to the agreement in June last year. While North Korea has continued to seek a nuclear state status and develop its weapons of mass destruction, South Korea's new government this year is seeking to build trust and diplomacy with Pyongyang. After a series of dovish gestures since its inauguration, President Lee Jae-myung last month ordered ministries to work towards restoring the September military agreement proactively in stages.
The essence of the pact is not so much removing the security risk, but it's the most basic safety apparatus to prevent accidental clashes or war from breaking out. So it doesn't necessarily resolve the situation, but without it, the situation is much more dangerous.
While proponents deem it an essential confidence-building and risk reduction measure, others have long voiced concerns that given the North's track record of literally blowing up deals, South Korea would only be letting its guard down. In any case, North Korea for now seems disinterested in rapprochement, particularly as it's benefiting from aiding Russia's war in Ukraine.
If the war ends quickly, North Korea-U.S. dialogue will draw closer, and the possibility of inter-Korean dialogue cannot be ruled out. However, if the negotiations to end the Ukraine war stretch on, North Korea will maintain its stance of treating the South and the U.S. as hostile states, applying pressure on the South.
While inter-Korean relations remain elusive, the fate of the dormant agreement also remains uncertain. But what's clear is that conditions on the Korean peninsula and its surrounding geopolitical environment have changed vastly over the last 7 years, making terms for military restraint that much harder to achieve and perhaps all the more necessary. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
In other news, Arirang TV hosted a special Korea Day event in New York to promote the country ahead of the President Lee Jae-myung's attendance at the UN General Assembly. The event took place on Wednesday local time at Citi Field during a Major League Baseball game between the New York Mets and the San Diego Padres. Promotional videos showcasing Korea's travel destinations and cultural heritage were shown on the stadium's large screens. Through this initiative, Arirang TV was able to introduce Korean culture to the thousands sitting in the audience. And on the cultural front, the southern port city of Busan continues to draw visitors from around the world for this year's Busan International Film Festival, with several global collaborative films with Korean movie makers. Our culture correspondent Park Gon-woo gives us a glimpse.
Made with Korea. Among hundreds of films premiering in Busan, it's easy to see how deeply Korean movie makers are involved, not only in homegrown productions, but also through collaborations that cross borders. One standout is The Protector, the first ever Hollywood film led by a Korean production company. Premiering in Busan for the first time, the filmmakers shared their excitement about being part of such a groundbreaking project.
We're just scratching the surface of how Korean and American Hollywood productions can be made together, really work together to kind of condense the script and really get to the core, the essence of it that could really affect people on a worldwide level.
In the past few years, Korean content has become very big outside of Korea. Being able to create this story, it's an honest piece of work, and that translates to any culture.
Another buzzworthy project is Hana Korea, which depicts a North Korean defector's life through a Northern European director's perspective. The scenario was assisted by Sharon Choi, director Bong Joon-ho's translator during his Oscar win, and performed by Korean actors to deliver authenticity. The Busan International Film Festival is alive with movie fans from around the world, and they're expected to keep coming over the next few days. What are they expecting to see? Definitely more of these collaborative films, the ones made with Korea, from Hollywood to Europe.
Good for cultural exchange and learning from each other, also in the art of movie making, can be very beneficial too.
I really like different perspectives. It feels a bit more emotional. Just watching films in languages I don't really understand feels like I am appreciating the acting.
Likewise, the Japanese hit Gokuho that surpassed 10 million viewers in Japan, the first case a Korean director has achieved such a record, and the remake of The Wedding Banquet by a Korean-American director, featuring renowned Korean actor Yoon Yo-jung, also premieres throughout the festival. With many of these intriguing collaborative projects being showcased in Busan, why not try taking this cinematic journey beyond borders, made with Korea? Park Gon-woo, Arirang News, Busan.
Good morning, I'm Choi Ji-hee, and this is The World Now. U.S. President Donald Trump has publicly praised the indefinite suspension of Jimmy Kimmel Live by ABC following remarks Kimmel made about Charlie Kirk's death. Trump also said some TV networks should have their licenses taken away. ABC, owned by Disney, announced on Wednesday evening that Jimmy Kimmel Live will be suspended indefinitely after the Federal Communications Commission threatened action over Kimmel's September 15th monologue. In that monologue, Kimmel had condemned reactions by some conservatives to the assassination of Charlie Kirk, suggesting they were trying to score political points. President Trump reacted on his social media on Thursday, celebrating the suspension and calling Kimmel talentless. He also said the show had bad ratings, while urging other late-night hosts who criticized him to face similar repercussions. Meanwhile, the chairman of the FCC said broadcasters will be held accountable to the public interest. Mass protests erupted across France as hundreds of thousands of workers, union members, and citizens mobilized to reject the government's proposed budget cuts. Union leaders estimated that over 1 million people took part, while the Interior Ministry estimated that there were around 500,000 protesters and that 80,000 police officers were deployed. The protests are against an austerity plan outlined by former Prime Minister François Bayrou, which includes cuts in public spending, possible elimination of holidays, pension adjustments, and trimming benefits. Thursday's strikes follow the Block Everything anti-government protests that took place earlier and come a week after the appointment of new Prime Minister Sebastián Lecornu. A United Nations Security Council resolution that demanded an immediate, permanent ceasefire in Gaza, the release of all hostages, and access to humanitarian aid deliveries was vetoed by the United States on Thursday. 14 non-U.S. members were in favor of the resolution, drafted by 10 non-permanent members, but it was blocked by the U.S. veto, the sixth time Washington has used the measure in the nearly two-year war. The U.S. justified its veto by saying the resolution failed to condemn Hamas sufficiently and did not explicitly recognize Israel's right to self-defense. London Fashion Week kicked off on Thursday and will run through September 22nd. There are 50 catwalk shows, 19 presentations, over 60 side events, and more than 150 designers participating. The British Fashion Council has taken steps to improve designer access, waiving participation fees for official scheduled shows, and increasing support, particularly for emerging designers. Early highlights include the runway debut of Maximilian Rayner, who is known for using sustainable materials such as fabric scraps.
Another day, another round of rain across the country. Showers will begin on the central west coast this morning, and by tonight, the rain clouds will cover most of the country, bringing rain through tomorrow, but the east coast might see rain lingering into tomorrow night. Chungcheong-Namdo province and west of Jeollabuk-do could see more than 80 millimeters of heavy rainfall. The capital region will get 10 to 40 millimeters. In terms of temperatures, it's going to be similar but breezier than yesterday, most parts of Korea hovering in the low 20s. Seoul noticed daytime highs going down 5 degrees lower this afternoon. I mean, it was a chilly start to the day, to exaggerate a bit, and highs will only get up to 21 degrees, but Busan and Jeju will be still very warm at 28 and 30 degrees respectively. After the rain clears, morning lows could go down even further, while the refreshing weather will continue throughout the weekend.
That's all we have for this morning. Arirang News will be back at 5 p.m. Korea time. Thanks for watching.